Alright, so now that we've seen the entire card list spoiled for Lost Caverns of Ixalan, I wanted to make a top 10 video for the top 10 cards in this set. And this list was quite difficult to make because the overall power level of this set is very high. That's something I kind of wanted to make a video on just on itself, is the overall power level of this set is, I feel like it's one of the best sets we've seen in quite a long time. And there were about 30 cards that I wanted to put on this top 10 list, but obviously 30 cards can't fit into 10, so I had to narrow it down. So if there's a card that's missing from the list that you think should be on it, that's probably why it very well could be on the list, but we had to narrow it down to 10. And for this list, I'm including only cards from the set proper. So what I mean by that is I'm not going to include any commander deck cards, any cards that are special guests or from the list. I'm also not going to include the Jurassic Park cards. And one more group of cards that I'm not including are reprints, because if a card is being printed before, we kind of already know how good it is. So I feel like it wouldn't be so interesting to include reprints on the list because you'd probably just put Cavern of Souls at number 1 anyway. So we're going to start off at number 10 here with an uncommon. Number 10 is Spelunking. This is a green enchantment. It costs 3 mana. It says, when it enters the battlefield, draw a card, then you can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. If you put a cave onto the battlefield this way, you gain 4 life. Also, lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So that second ability there is the main reason why this card makes it onto the list, because there are many lands that come into play tapped which are very powerful, and this allows you to take advantage of those lands right away. I mean, there's an entire modern deck based around this idea with Amulet Titan, right? But also ignoring that ability, this card is still quite good because you could compare it to something like Explore. So Explore costs only 2 mana, and it does basically the same thing as the first part of this card. I feel like most of the time with Spelunking, you can kind of ignore the part where you gain 4 life if you put a cave into play. It could be relevant. There could be caves that see play in decks outside of just having cave synergy, so maybe it could be relevant that way, but I feel like most of the time you'll probably just ignore that part of this card. But what this card does have up on Explore is the fact that it's a permanent. So with Explore, you use it once and it's gone. With this one though, you could flicker it if you want and just keep drawing cards and putting lands into play. So I feel like this card will definitely see play in Commander, and it could potentially get there in other formats as well. Next up at number 9, we have a rare. This is Get Lost. So this is a 2 mana instant that costs 1 and a white. It's very simple. It says destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. Its controller creates 2 map tokens. So the card that I would immediately compare this to is Fateful Absence, which serves a very similar function. However, it gives the opponent a clue instead of 2 map tokens. And Fateful Absence does see play in competitive formats, mainly in Pioneer, I think. But we kind of have yet to see how good are map tokens, because they're a new kind of token, and to me they seem pretty good. So giving your opponent 2 of them could be a very big drawback. However, this card does have some additional flexibility because it can destroy an enchantment, which I feel like is pretty big because this is main deckable enchantment destruction. And I think that's the main reason for why this makes it on the list. If it wasn't able to target an enchantment, it probably would be just outside the top 10, because then it would basically just be a Fateful Absence that, you know, gives maps instead of a clue. But the added flexibility, I think, makes this quite a bit better. Next up at number 8, we have another rare. This is a creature this time though. This is Sentinel of the Nameless City. So this is a 3 mana, 3/4 Merfolk Warrior Scout. It has Vigilance. It says when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you make a map token. So this seems very pushed for 3 mana. Just on its base stats alone, a 3/4 for 3 mana is very good. The fact that it has Vigilance is also very good. It does do something immediately when it comes into play, so it checks off that box. And you get recursive value with this whenever you're able to attack, so this does a lot for 3 mana. And the card that I would probably compare this to is Tireless Tracker. It's not super similar, but it's similar enough to be able to make a comparison, because Tireless Tracker is also a 3-drop in green that can keep on getting you value in the form of tokens. Tireless Tracker was a multi-format all-star. It doesn't see so much play anymore, but it definitely was a big card in the past. And with this card here, it also comes down to kind of how good are map tokens, because we don't exactly know yet, because once again, we haven't really seen them played before, but if maps are as good as I think they potentially could be, I think this card could be really powerful. Next up at number 7, we have our first mythic card. This is Bloodletter of Aclazotz. I think this card is really good. So it costs 4 mana, it costs 1 black. It's a 2/4 vampire demon. It has flying, and it says if an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice that much life instead. I'm a big fan of simple yet powerful static effects like this, and I think this is a really good one. So this card is a 2/4, but it can kind of be like a 4/4 if you look at it the right way, because if it does damage to your opponent, it's going to do 2, but that would be doubled, so it would be 4. In Commander, I think it's kind of a no-brainer that this card will be very good, because you could compare it to something like Wound Reflection, which is very good in that format. But even outside of Commander, I think this card could see play, maybe especially in something like a mono-black or black-red aggro deck as a top-end card, because it does have an immediate effect when it comes into play. Say, for example, you curve out, you go, 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, or you could even miss one of those creatures on the way there. If for your 4-drop you play this and you attack in, it's gonna immediately essentially double the damage of any of your other creatures which you played on the way to this. Or it could also even be really good in like a black-red burn style of deck, because once again you play this and now all of your burn spells do twice as much damage, basically. And it does have to be on your turn, but also one thing that's cool about this card is that it says if they would lose life, not if they would be dealt damage. So this would work with effects that drain your opponent as well, that you typically see on black cards where they lose life rather than take damage. So this card I think is pretty sweet. Definitely I see it being played in Commander and potentially in other formats as well. Here at number 6, we have another card which is quite similar to an older card. This is Molten Collapse. This is a rare sorcery. It costs 2 mana, a black and a red. It says choose one. If you descended this turn, you can choose both instead. You can destroy a creature or planeswalker, or you can destroy a non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. So the card to immediately compare this to is Dreadbore, which does basically this but less. This is kind of just a strict upgrade to Dreadbore, and Dreadbore did see play in multiple formats. I believe even to this day it does still sometimes see play in Pioneer and Modern. And the upside for this one can maybe seem a little bit small, because destroying a non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less might seem kind of narrow, but there are actually quite a few targets for that. Maybe something like a Chalice of the Void or an Amulet of Vigor. You could even just take out an opponent's treasure or clue or something like that. And if you're playing this card in formats with fetch lands, it's very easy to be able to turn on Descend, because you just sacrifice your fetch land and there you go, now you have Descend. Potentially this card I think could be the one out of this entire list that might see the most play, because it's one that's just ubiquitously good. Like it's good in any black-red deck, and black-red is kind of the deck to play these days in pretty much any format. Oh yeah, this card is very good. Up next we have another rare. This is an artifact, and I feel like it mostly has potential in Standard, but maybe it could get there in other formats as well. This is Subterranean Schooner. This is a vehicle, so it costs 2 mana, 1 and a blue. It's a 3/4. It says whenever it attacks, target creature that crewed it this turn explores, and you can crew it for 1. So once again, I'm going to compare this to an older card, which also was very good. Good enough to get banned, actually. This is a card that you can compare to Smuggler's Copter. It has the same mana value, it has the same crew cost, it actually has better stats, and it has a very similar effect as well. So this does look pretty similar to Smuggler's Copter, but it has some quite notable differences. The main one being, I think, that it's not colorless. This is a blue card, so you can't put this in literally any deck. Also, Copter had evasion, and this one doesn't. However, this does have an extra point of toughness, which I think is actually pretty big, because a 3/4 for 2 mana, those are really good stats. Another thing this has up on Copter is that it can actually get you card advantage, because when you explore, you can draw a card if you hit a land. With Copter, you're looting, so you're not actually going up on the number of cards you have, you're just filtering through the cards you have, unless you can take advantage of discarding things, which definitely you can in some decks. So I'm not saying that this is better than Copter, I don't think that it's even as good as it, but it's similar enough that I think it has quite a lot of potential, and I feel like it deserves a spot on this list somewhere. Next up at number 4, we have another Mythic. This one is a big boy. This is Ghalta Stampede Tyrant. This costs 8 mana, 5 green, green, green. It's a 12/12 legendary creature elder dinosaur, as Ghalta tends to be. It has trample, and it says, when it enters the battlefield, put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. So it does cost a lot of mana at 8, but what if you just cheat it into play? You know, you could be playing sneak attack this into play, and then just dump your entire hand into play, because it doesn't say when you cast this or anything, it's just when it enters the battlefield. So I feel like what makes this card really powerful is the ability to be able to cheat it into play. There's a pretty significant drawback, because it doesn't really do a whole lot if you don't already have stuff in your hand to be able to play. So you do need other things to go with this card in order to make it truly powerful, but even if you have nothing, it is still a 12/12 trample. Next up at number 3, we have a card which I originally had taken off of this list, but then when I thought about it some more, I actually put it up ranked quite highly. So this is another rare. This is Tishana's Tidebinder. This is a 3 mana, 3/2 Merfolk Wizard. It has Flash, and it says when it enters the battlefield, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. So we have seen effects like this in the past. Maybe on something like Nimble Obstructionist, which was actually a pretty hyped card when it came out back in the day. It is actually still played in a few Modern, Pioneer, and Legacy deck lists, and I feel like this card might be just better. Because with Nimble Obstructionist, you have to cycle it, you pay 3 mana, and you get to counter something. But with this one, you just play it and you counter something, and you have a 3/2 in play, so you're committing to the board as well as countering something rather than just cycling something and drawing a card. Those effects can be better or worse depending on what kind of specific effects you want in your deck, but I feel like this one might be better a lot of the time. And also what's cool about this one is that you counter the ability, but then as long as this remains in play, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as this remains in play. So if it has other abilities, it loses those as well. So even in standard, or I guess any format with Shieldred, you could use this against Shieldred to counter Shieldred's triggered ability once, and then as long as this remains in play, Shieldred just becomes a 4/5. It loses all abilities, so it doesn't even have Death Touch anymore. This would also be cool to counter Planeswalker abilities, because you could counter it once, but then when this remains in play, the Planeswalker does nothing. So when I started thinking about this card in that regard, I ended up ranking it quite highly. Next at number 2, this is another Mythic, and I've gone back and forth on this one a bit, but I ended up ranking it very highly at number 2 here. This is Bonehorde Dracosaur. This is a 5 mana, 5/5 flying first strike. It's a dinosaur dragon. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. If you exiled a land this way, you make a 3/1 red dinosaur creature token. If you exiled a non-land card this way, you make a treasure. So when I first saw this card, I thought, wow, this seems really powerful. When I thought about it some more, I kind of realized that it's a 5 mana creature that does kind of nothing when it comes into play. But then when I thought about it even more, I realized it's a 5 mana, 5/5 flying first strike, and that's a really good body. So yeah, it doesn't do anything. The turn it comes into play, you need to make it to your next upkeep before you get all of the power out of this card. But 5/5 flying first strike for 5 mana is pretty aggressively costed. It also has 2 very relevant creature types in being both a dinosaur and a dragon, but if this does survive for a turn cycle and get to trigger its ability on your upkeep, that's just so much value, because, you know, on top of your 5/5 flying first strike, you essentially get to draw 2 cards. It's not drawing 2 cards, but it's very similar to it. Then you can also make a 3/1 dinosaur and a treasure. If you hit 2 lands, you're only going to make one of those things, or if you hit 2 non-lands, you're also only going to make one. But if you hit a land and a non-land, you get to play those cards, And also you get a dinosaur and a treasure, which is insane value for 5 mana. So when I thought about this card in that respect, I put it way up here at number 2. So we've made it to number 1, what could be the top card for this set. There's a lot of cards that actually could go in this spot, probably some cards that I didn't even include in the top 10, because as I said before, there are so many good cards in this set. It's just hard to make a top 10 list, but here is what I have at number 1. This is the This is the Skull Spore Nexus. So this card looks very similar to another card which is incredibly powerful. However, the similarities kind of end at just the way that it looks. Because you could compare this to the Great Henge. That's also a mythic green artifact. That one costs 9 mana, this one costs 8, but they both say this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, so they do look very similar in that regard, but they have very different abilities. This one says, whenever one or more non-token creatures you control die, create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness each equal to the total power of those creatures. And also you can pay 2 and tap it to double target creature's power until end of turn. So I feel like usually when you cast this card, it will probably end up costing maybe 4 or 5 mana. It could be as cheap as 2 mana, pretty easily actually, but let's say that it costs 4 mana. Basically what you're doing is getting really good protection against having your creatures removed, because if one of your creatures dies, you're going to get, a fungus dinosaur that's as big as that creature. If all of your creatures die, you're only going to get 1 token, but it's probably going to be pretty big. So the ability to basically replace any of your creatures with something just as big is kind of nuts. But then the activated ability on this is really powerful as well, because it's very cheap to activate. It's only 2 mana and you tap this, and you can double a creature's power till end of turn. That, depending on what creature you've got, that can be a really big boost. And the fact that you can do it at instant speed is pretty big as well, because, you could just attack in with multiple creatures, assuming at least one of them is unblocked. You can just double that and get in for a ton of damage. Or, in green, creatures typically tend to have trample, so if your creature is blocked anyway, you can still double its power and get in a bunch of damage that way too. Or what you can do is, if you know one of your creatures is about to die, or maybe, say, in response to a removal spell, you can just activate this and double the power of the creature that's about to die, which means the token that you're going to get from this card is going to have twice as much power as it normally would. So this card, for sure, it's going to be really good in Commander. I expect this to probably see play in other formats as well, and I think it's going to do some really powerful things, and for those reasons, I have it at number 1 here. So that was my top 10 list for Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I feel like it's gonna look different from probably anyone's top 10 list, because there are so many good cards in the set. Every list can have a lot of variety to it. Let me know what are your top cards for the set though. Leave them in the comments below. I'd be interested to read how my list might differ from other people's. But otherwise though, thanks for watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. I'd encourage everyone to come join my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the video description below. And also, if you'd like to purchase any Magic cards, you can get those by going to face2facegames.com. They're the largest Magic store in Canada. They're also a sponsor of the channel, and you can use code 8thPlayStave at the checkout to save 5% on your order. They do also ship internationally, as long as it's not sealed products, so you can order if you're outside of Canada as well for card singles. And also, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the patrons that support me on Patreon. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.